Welcome to Dare to Speak, difficult conversations that can change everything. This is a place for you to bring those difficult conversations that you've been mulling over, that you've been thinking about while you've been walking around, doing the washing up or commuting to work. I'm Eve Stanway. I am a philosopher, psychotherapist of 25 years, divorce and breakup coach, and I help people in the moments where there's a difficult conversation they just don't know how to handle. This is a moment, your moment, to pause, reflect, and have a bit of breathing space to think about what matters to you and how to tackle those difficult moments. Using insight, reflection, case studies, and examples, I will guide you through those difficult conversations in a safe and constructive way. So let's begin. Hello and welcome to the next edition of Dare to Speak, difficult conversations that change everything. This is a space where we talk about how on the other side of a difficult conversation or a series of difficult conversations, there can be openness, peace, clarity, and shared feelings. But getting to that can be quite hard. So today I've got Alex Croxford, who is going to be talking to us about difficult conversations. Alex is a relational expert in healing after betrayal. Welcome, Alex. Welcome to Dare to Speak.
Hi, Eve. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
You're very welcome. So tell me a little bit more about what you do, because I think you really do work in the area of difficult conversations.
Yes, you definitely could say that. So I really work with women who have had an affair and are currently in the aftermath of that affair, dealing with the shame, the guilt, the grief that often comes in that space. And it might seem to some of your listeners quite a bizarre niche to have acquired, but having been through my own experience of having had an affair in my marriage with my ex-husband, I felt this very strong pull to create a safe space for women to use this pain ultimately as a portal home to themselves. And that is the work that I offer.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think it really is important. You know, in the 25 years I've been working with people, betrayal, infidelity, it's very easy to make kind of blanket judgments and really quick kind of leaps to kind of accusation or, you know, shaming and blaming. And it can really polarize something into saying, well, that person must be the bad person. But of course, it's a much more complicated experience. And I've been in that experience of being both cheated on and doing the cheating. And both of those involve a really they involve a really complicated internal dialogue. So, you know, just for our listeners, you know, we've got listeners, we've got men and women, we've got men and women who are listening out of interest. They're listening because they're interested in difficult conversations. We've got people who are listening because they're listening on behalf of their parents. You know, they've been through their parents' separation and divorce, or they've learned in childhood that it's hard to talk about things. I have a feeling that at the root of infidelity and there is often something to do with a person's ability to express how they're really feeling in a particular situation. Would you say that that's true?
Yes, I really agree with that. And I think that was definitely my own experience and so many of the clients that I work with too. And, you know, my core belief, which ties into this, is that at the root of betrayal is self-betrayal. You know, most people who have found themselves, certainly women, I work with women, men I know they have similar experiences, but I want to be clear that this is fundamentally women that I work with. that after years of not saying what we really mean, not
Mm,
speaking up when we're feeling hurt, or we are trying to communicate in ways that aren't actually healthy or aren't actually
mm,
getting our point across in the right way. So
mm.
we feel like we're not seen or not heard or dismissed in some way, or perhaps we have learnt to swallow our words and not actually speak what's true. That is ultimately all self-betrayal. And after
Yeah.
years and years of doing that and not knowing how to speak or not
Mm,
feeling safe to speak,
mm.
eventually that suppression tends to find itself spilling out sideways. And for some people, that looks like having an affair.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. And I said earlier on, it's very polarizing because there's this idea that, well, then you're the bad person because you've done the bad thing.
Mhm.
Relationships are really complicated, and there is actually maintaining really good communication in a relationship with yourself and with the other person. You know, they say you've got to work at relationships, but what you're really working it at, I think, is keeping the dialogue flowing. And when that's no longer safe, or it doesn't feel safe, or it's become really uncomfortable, or the thing that you want to say you feel is too much, or that it can't be said, then at that moment of abandoning what it is that you really feel, it shows up, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Just in that space. So tell me a little bit, are you all right to talk a little bit about your own background? When I was first cheated on, I was cheated on by somebody, and I can remember not even registering it as a cheat. I don't know what I thought. It was somebody, it was the guy that I'd been going out with had slept with a friend, and she came and told me. And I honestly, I don't know, it was when I was 19. I honestly remember just feeling really let down by them both, but I didn't change my relationship status. And I didn't really even stop being her friend. I didn't really register it. And I think it's really important to say that because at some level, I don't think I'd learned. I just don't think I'd been taught what to think about something like that. So I'm kind of imagining that by not even being knowing how to think about something like that, that must be what it's like for a lot of people because
I will definitely share my story, but I just want to touch on
mm,
what you just said because it was almost like that 19-year-old version of you had not yet
mm,
been conditioned by society or by the world and how to feel about infidelity. It might also have been a way of protecting yourself and shutting
yeah,
down a part of that. We don't know, but I think one of the biggest things that happens right now in 2026 in the Western world is that infidelity is seen as a crime worse than murder in some ways. You know, the
yeah,
abuse that
mm,
I receive on social media, and so many people who comment on my reels also get abuse from other people because the pain ultimately of betrayal is enormous. Like, I don't want to deny, and I want to be really clear to your
yeah,
listeners that under no circumstances am I making excuses for infidelity or saying that we need to make small of how painful it is, because that's fundamentally
mm,
not the truth. Being cheated on for most people is an extremely painful experience, and there is
mm,
trauma in that. So I just want to acknowledge that.
mm,
But I also want to say that the levels of hate and shaming that happens to people that have done this is
yeah,
incredibly damaging and doesn't open a
yeah,
conversation like this, difficult
yeah,
conversation
yeah,
that we're even having about
mm,
infidelity. And so in my story, my experience, I was actually I was actually somebody who up until the age of 34 was very successful. I had a career in television. I was a television executive from the outside. My life was very neatly put together. I had the husband and the house with the extension and the group of friends that I'd
mm,
party with every weekend, this glossy job in TV. And what was happening under the surface that no one saw, this very confident, shiny, put together person, was years of disordered eating, a really dark relationship with my body, and an inability to really truly speak how I felt. I didn't ask for what I needed. I was just the easy breezy wife. I just thought I had to be the one that didn't really say anything, make life easy for everybody else, put my husband's feelings first, had a lot of toxic friendships, or several toxic friendships in that time as well. And this also coincided with me not having any relationship with my emotions. I didn't know how to feel anything. I was the one that was in control. I never cried in front of anybody. Anyone would tell me, "Oh, you're so together, Alex. You're such a together person." But underneath the surface was someone who felt a lot but didn't know how to feel. And after me and my ex-husband started on a fertility journey, I wasn't able to conceive straight away. My menstrual cycle was all over the place, and I did not know how to process the grief of not being able to conceive. And at the time, I didn't know this was happening, but now I can look back. And within a year of being married, I found myself in a situation of cheating on my husband. And I was so confused by my behavior, because I felt I loved him. I thought I was happy. I thought I had this great life, except for this grief that I wasn't processing around the fertility. And I suddenly felt like I was lost at sea. I didn't know who I was. How could I do this? I thought I was a good person. I thought I was someone who had morals. I loved him. How could I hurt him? And I internalized this belief that I was a terrible person, and I deserved all of the pain that was coming to me. And I also thought, talking about difficult conversations, that the best thing to do was to not tell him, and to keep my mouth shut, and to forget what had happened. And, the word affair has so many meanings for different people. My experience wasn't a love affair. I didn't fall in love with this person, but there was a physical relationship that happened more than once. And I never wanted to leave my husband, so I couldn't understand how I got here, but I suppressed it. I kept my mouth shut. And for a year and a half, no, it was nearly 2 years, I didn't say anything. And about a year into this process, I knew I needed some help. So I started to work on myself. And as I started to work on myself with a coach, I started to discover this part of me that was terrified of using my voice. I was terrified of being seen as anything except perfect. I was terrified of being vulnerable, and I was terrified of rejection. And so I kept swallowing it down, hoping and praying that one day I was going to forget about it, until eventually, in the middle of COVID, after, being locked up in the house together for a long period of time, I realized, and having done a lot of work on meeting that younger part of me that learned to not use her voice, that I had to tell him the truth, and I had to risk everything that was going to come from me having that difficult conversation. And so, yeah, that was 6 years ago.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that. And I think what you've shared there is something that I've heard. I think the assumption is that somebody goes and has an affair because there's just a passion of the heart, and they're going off and they know what they're doing. In my experience working with men as well as women around, it is not like that. It is symptomatic of often quite a dark internal silence that has got bigger and bigger and bigger and turned into a kind of big masking performance. It's not authentic, clear decision making, as we would call it. So although we can say that, oh, well, you knew what you were doing, you could have made different choices, understanding where those choices come from, and understanding that in that space, the decision making is happening because the choices in front of you just feel like the choices that you're going to make or you can make. But often, and what you've described really well there, is that lack of why am I doing this? It's not quite what I think. What is it happening for? Because what then happens is when the difficult conversation happens and somebody finds out that you've had an affair or whatever you say, the conversation that you have is probably going to look for clarity where there is none. It's going to look for explanation where you really don't know. And as you struggle to find those reasons, it's all going to sound like excuses. It may even sound listening to your story, oh, well, she's just saying that now. But the truth of the matter is, it's not clear, is it?
I absolutely, yeah, I can see that there's probably going to be people listening to this, as people do on social media, and they say, oh, yeah, you knew what you were doing. This is just an excuse. And I get that. I can see how that might be how you perceive things. But from my own experience and so many people that I work with, it's this same thing of, I don't know how I got here. I thought I was a good person. I'm a lawyer. I'm a doctor. I'm a, professional X, Y, and Z. I've got a great, track record in my life. And now I've done this and I don't know how I got here. And my belief is it's almost the performance that you referred to that we are living from in our relationships so often, or in our lives so often. It creates an almost deadness inside of us, when we can't speak our truth, or we don't know how to speak our truth. We don't know how to have conversations about how we feel or what we need or what we want or what's hurting us. We're almost betraying ourselves so much that our nervous system begins to think, well, maybe you're dead. Maybe there's nothing here. This is this deadness, which is why in affairs, so often people experience aliveness. I felt alive, I felt free, and I felt seen, and I felt heard, and it's not really about the other person, almost never.
No. That is. And I have to say, unless somebody is in a situation where they've been kind of groomed by another person and they're being kind of groomed into a toxic relationship, which is something that does happen, where people will earmark somebody who's in precisely that vulnerable space and kind of lure them in. But the majority of time, what we're talking about is what I would call a psychological breakdown internally, that then means in the same way that people might do other behaviors, they move towards being noticed or being, in the affair. In those moments, they feel like they're being valued or recognized. And that brings about this kind of feeling of relief and release. But the betrayal is the betrayal, exactly as you say, of self. And I think this is kind of an important aspect of this when it comes to the idea of difficult conversations. So if we imagine that somebody has a friend who always lets them down, then what would happen is that we would stop trusting that friend. And trust is really about psychologically safety. It's like, oh, I feel safe to make an arrangement because I know you're going to turn up. But if you never do turn up, I'm going to feel less safe making that arrangement. And then that will be the loss of trust. So when we're talking about this self-betrayal, what we're talking about is we think we know ourselves and we think we're going to behave and act in certain ways. Then over time, we find that we're not doing it. So we lose trust, we lose psychological safety with ourselves. And in that moment, that's where the betrayal side, because we no longer really have faith in ourselves. And then lead us to behave in a way which will be an expression of that loss of faith, which often is an affair. So if we are blaming and we're getting kind of really up on our high horse and shaming somebody who's having an affair, we're kind of missing. It's not the same exactly. If somebody's got a mental health issue, calling them weak and saying, well, what you need to do is just pull yourself together and get on with it. The reality is, and I'm kind of going to put this out to listeners to really think about this. On one level, we could say it's true that somebody can just pull themselves together and get on with it. But the reality is what it costs to try and do that is exactly what you then describe your marriage as being, because that was you pulling yourself together and getting on with it. And it becomes the great pretense, doesn't it? The great performance, the great, oh, well, you know, everything's fine. But of course it's not, is it?
No, exactly. And it's what I say is it's that suppression and the denial of what's true and what's really there ends up spilling out sideways. And you know, you mentioned the affair as a relief to something. It's the same as when people turn to alcohol or drugs or gaming addiction or sex addiction or, you know, pornography addiction. It's a symptom. It's ultimately a way that those people have found to relieve an experience that's internal. It's just, or even workaholism, right? It's just there are certain addictions which are more, and symptoms of relief which are more acceptable to society than affairs. And again, I'm not justifying the affair, but we make space in society for people who have done X, Y, and Z because, you know, we can see perhaps there is an addiction or an issue, but there is no compassion for anybody who has acted out in this way. And there's no space to be able to say, okay, like take a breath. What was really truly going on for you? What was truly going on for you in your marriage? What do you really believe about yourself? What do you really believe about love? Does love feel safe to you? Does being vulnerable feel safe to you? And this is one of the reasons why it's so hard to have true conversations, because we're so petrified of being laughed at, shamed, ignored, not met.
Well, it goes back to, as a, you know, Brexit, you know, I still hear people say, oh, well, it's all been caused by Brexit. You know, with Brexit, half the people nearly voted to remain, and the other half voted to leave, slightly more voted to leave. So Brexit happened. I got very busy during that time because people were simply not willing to sit down and have a conversation with the person who'd voted the other way and find out what their reasons were. So the other thing I'd like to say about this is the law changed very recently to no-fault divorces. And one of the changes in the law, and it's really important, and I think it affects the viewpoint of infidelity. The change became a no-fault because previously you would have to prove an affair. You would have to prove that somebody had been unfaithful or unreasonable or abusive in order to be able to end a marriage. So what that does is that it really loads the dice to accusation. When they changed the law, which was a good change in my view, it was 2022, 2023, what that meant is whatever it was that your reasons were for wanting to end a marriage, there was no judgment on it. We're still full of people who've been raised to view the scarlet woman, the woman who has the affair, or the man who has the affair. We have a culture that still supports the idea that the person who does that is some kind of heinous human. But the reality is the law is now flattened out to understand that no, it's just a sign you shouldn't be married. You know, unless you want to work through it and solve what problems were and decide to stay married. Up to you.
Yeah.
You know, so what advice would you give somebody who finds themselves kind of maybe in this situation, Alex, and they're like going, oh, that's me, or that's nearly me, or that has been me? Like, is there any kind of words of wisdom that you would share?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, you're not a bad person. You're a person who's done a thing that could be labeled as bad by some people. But I do believe in my heart of hearts that it is a symptom, and it's a symptom of something far deeper than just what's happening in your relationship. Your relationship is a mirror to normally what's happening inside of you. Like my marriage was completely devoid or void of emotional intimacy. And so was I. I was completely disconnected from my own emotions. And so I could have just focused on the problem in the marriage and stayed at that surface level, or I could have got deeper to actually look at my relationship with myself and with my emotions, with love, with safety, with all of the other parts. And that, I would say, is if you are in this situation, either having had an affair, are tempted to have an affair, feel like you could have an affair, I'd say look at what is actually happening underneath this. Don't get fixated on what's happening in your marriage, because that is just a signpost to something that is happening far beneath the surface.
I completely agree with that. I think if you find yourself and you're living or you've been doing this, it's a sign of something. Judging people, calling them good or bad. And a number of times when I'm working with toxic relationships, there'll be somebody whose behavior is actually terrible, and they're saying, yes, but they're a good person. Or somebody who's doing something because they're in a moment of collapse, actually, and they're being said that they're a bad person. So generally, I'm going to advise everybody listening to be really careful about who we're calling good and who we're calling bad, and whether or not what we're doing is just putting a label on something we don't understand or they don't understand. And that we should always be willing to kind of have that difficult conversation with ourselves and say, well, why am I no longer speaking to that person because they had an affair? How do I know what happens? And the truth is, and this is me, 25 years of working with people in their relationships, we don't know what's happening in somebody's relationship. And even if we think we do, we don't know what's happening in their head.
No, that is very true.
It really is. So we're going to leave it there. I hope everybody who's been listening will have listened with openness and curiosity. This is something that we can all be affected by one way or another. This is something that we often see dramatized on the news and on media in a certain way. But underneath it, what we've got is we've got people, we've got humans, we've got relationships, we've got wider families. And I think what I come away is we don't know, so we need to be curious. Is there anything you would add to that, Alex?
No, I think that's really true. I think, if you do know somebody that's gone through this experience, just as Eve said, just get curious. And often the people who've had an affair might not even know how they got there either.
Yeah. I think that's just so important. This is not, for the majority of people, unless somebody is a serial philanderer, and they're very easy to spot people who are like that. It is usually somebody who's walked down an alley and doesn't know how the heck they got there. And once they're there, they have to deal with the consequences of that. And I think it should be all of our jobs to try and be supportive around that rather than accusatory.
Yeah.
That's what I would say. So if this topic, maybe it's got you thinking, please put some comments in the podcast comment, DM me, reach out. If you want to speak with Alex, if you want to learn more about what she does, you can reach out to me. You can look at your website is www.alexcroxford.com. Is that right? I'll put it in the show notes as well. And I just want to say thank you so much, Alex, for being willing to come on and talk about this important topic. It's enlightening for me to hear you talk, and I'm really grateful to you for it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Eve, and thank you everybody for having an open mind and listening.
Take care. Thank you.